When I was asked to do this, I thought, how can I approach it? And I've decided to approach it within a 100-year perspective. You know that 2018 is an anniversary in many respects. We've already been reminded of the 40 years of the Chinese opening up. It's 100 years of the end of World War I. It is 50 years of the Youth Revolution in the West, which is something I think we will hear of in this part of the world. It's 10 years after the Olympic Games in Beijing, and not least, it's 10 years after the financial crisis. So these are some of the elements which I've been thinking of in relation to cultural transformations and crisis. And I think it is important in this respect, and also within this time span, to consider that culture is obviously not a static thing. Culture is dynamic, culture is changing, culture has aspects of continuity, but if cultures and traditions are going to survive, they also have to change. So what you see here is a bit before 1918, the February Revolution in Petrograd, Leningrad, and Petersburg, leading to the Russian Revolution, to the establishment of the Soviet Union, and everybody here probably knows that in a legal respect, the Soviet legal theory had a big impact also on Chinese legal theory for several years. So we have a cultural or a changing cultural impact here on most of the world generally, but not least on China in the 20th century. I've been collecting images for many, many years. I have thousands of images from my trips to China. So I went through them when I was preparing here, and I came across this image. And I put it, for my preparation, I put it into Google's image search. It's a picture, or not this picture, but I took the picture in Shanghai at the Shanghai Art Museum in 2013. I didn't know who had taken it, where it came from, but thanks to Google image search, I can now tell you that this is the famous French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson, who has made this photograph in Shanghai in 1948. And Google also informed me that this was a description of a collapse of monetary values, as the value of paper money sank in December 14 to January 49. The Kuomintang decided to distribute 40 grams of gold per person. And with the gold rush in December, thousands, the people you saw before, thousands came out and waited in line for hours. The police, equipped with the remnants of the armies of the international concession, made only a gesture towards maintaining order. 10 people were crushed to death. So you have here another major shift in the Chinese context towards the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And with that, I think this is something to think of also when we have these major social, economic, political shifts. We also have shifts of institutions. We've been speaking today of the changes of the dispute resolution institutions, but we have seen such similar changes of courts and dispute resolutions at specific times in history, at the beginning of the 20th century, after World War II, etc., etc. So this is something I think I have missed a bit in this the approaches we've heard, we've heard very many very detailed descriptions, but as an outsider, as somebody who doesn't deal with international dispute resolution, it has, at least for me, seemed to be quite difficult to understand a broader picture. What is going on here in the changes we're witnessing at the moment? I will skip the cultures of rights, authorities, and war. In the 68, I think you can say that within a Nordic context, this brought some of the institutions down to the earth. It brought the courts and the judges down on a level which was more in line with the users of the courts, and to some extent we're perhaps seeing that still. But that is not the issue here. We are then also witnessing in the Chinese case this major transition after the death of Mao in 1976, which led to the opening up. So I think this is really something also which in a cultural sense is interesting, how, of course, a regime change introduces a cultural change and introduces this economic transition. And Mao's death took place only a very few years after the international or the start of the neoliberal era with the elections of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan at the end of the 70s. So there is a confluence here between the period of Chinese opening up and the period of neoliberal globalizations. These are, to a certain extent, there is a synchronicity, but there is also a certain overlap and interaction, perhaps a hybridity, which Joanna is talking about in her paper, also in this perspective. So what happened? You will know more about that. I'm presenting here some of my own pictures over a period of about 10 years of the opening up. I'm calling it a culture of wealth and watches. You have probably seen many of these images yourself. I have observed over a period of 10 years what I'm almost going to say is an obsession with watches in China. If you go along the Bund in Shanghai, you can expect to see a considerable number of advertisements, very big advertisements, for analog watches, old style watches, not digital watches, but analog watches. I have for years tried to understand the symbolism of these watches. I know some of them in China have been related to corruption, but I think there's something else at stake here. Maybe it is about control of time. And as we have seen today, it's easy to lose control of time. So keeping control is perhaps something which I think is important in many cultures, but very important in Chinese culture. This attempt to keep control. But if we look at the last century, I think we will have to acknowledge that is very, very difficult. That keeping control is very, very difficult. And of course, this picture of the former Berlin Wall, which has now become a kind of a museum installation, is a picture also of some of these collapses we have seen more or less every 10 years within the last century. So it is. I have myself looked into, and it is very often said when you speak about Chinese legal culture that there is a focus of harmony, and a focus on long-term perspectives, and a focus on stability. But I think it could perhaps be questioned if you take this view of the 100 years or so we have been dealing with. And I noticed yesterday or day before when I was preparing this, that if you look at the present government in China, Xi Jinping, I think, is born in 1953. His father was born in 1913. So the present leadership in China is actually covering these 100 years, or more than these 100 years. This is probably related to the fact that we are living in aging societies, etc., etc. But it is also something which I think will be influencing our societies. Go ahead, Hanne. Okay, so what I also did when trying to look at this legal culture issues was I was in Beijing in December. And came across and visited the Bookworm, the English language bookshop in Beijing, and came across the crime novels by He Jiahong, who must be a colleague of several of you from the Renmin University, where he is a professor of criminal law. And he says in an interview about his work with literature and law, that is his combination, that academic law books have a relatively short lifespan. Law changes quickly in China, and the books that I wrote 20 years ago have become irrelevant. In fact, they are well and truly history. Everyone knows that this type of academic literature becomes obsolete after a few years. Conversely, my novels enjoy a long shelf life. So today people in China are not really interested in stories about the past, and they are indifferent to the Cultural Revolution, but he thinks he wants to discover this history and the memory. And how does he do it? I don't know if any of you have read these crime novels, but I think they can be recommended, especially for a legal audience, because they are written by this law professor who uses, of course, his professional background, but also the literary approach. And these are the two novels which I've managed to read so far. And these are the two, the Hanging Devils is the first and most important, and the one on black holes is the second. And this is from some kind of book review I found on the internet, which I think illustrates also Joanna's point about hybridity. This is read this handsome, US-educated, mainland lawyer Hong Jun makes his debut in well-received Hanging Devils, focusing on the real-life rape and murder of a young woman. In Black Holes, set in 1995, he agrees to defend Jia Jie, an ambitious young securities trader charged with fraud. She has suffered huge losses betting on the market, but claims she's been set up possibly by a colleague and rival for the attentions of the company's beautiful clerk, Fan Zhong. Beauty is a commodity of enormous importance in a market economy. The beauty industry is a major industry. I don't know how, but much of the luxury industry you can see in relation to China is, of course, also related to this area. So this is you have a very, very quick idea about what this is about. this is a quote from The Hanging Devil, which I think to a certain extent must express not only the view of the author and law professor of criminal law, but the protagonist in the book, but also of the author. And it's a figure in The Hanging Devil who says to his sister, who is a lawyer, "The law," he says, "the law, it sounds so great, doesn't it? It was the cloak of justice, but it's always double-dealing. To the ordinary people, it behaves like a stern grandfather, but when it comes to dealing with the ones who makes the rules, the party officials, it turns into a cowardly son of a bitch. And the more important the official, the more insignificant the law becomes. In this world, if you have power, then you are the law. You can take your law and feed it to the dogs. But I tell you," he added, wagging his finger, "even the dogs wouldn't want to eat it." I think this is a significant statement by a Chinese law professor from one of the major universities. And I think it is related to something which has not been spoken about much, but which is well known in many cultures, that there is very limited trust of the legal systems. I think you can see that in many countries in the world. The trust of law is not particularly strong. Yeah, thank you. When I hear these presentations about international law and also the low level of cases, I think there are very many elements which are perhaps underestimated or not addressed so strongly, maybe because we are dealing with as professionals, and we would like to present our own instruments in the best light, which is understandable. But that is why I think the literary approach has a very big merit, because it can cover elements and also of the culture which are not particularly well described otherwise, because it's difficult to find a language. I have less than 2 minutes. So this element of distrust, I think, is something which is not, of course, limited to China. I was reading this blog or this book by Dutch anthropologist Joris Luijendijk, who wrote on the financial crisis. He had a blog in The Guardian for 2 years, and his very short conclusion is nobody takes responsibility. Nobody in the banking sector takes responsibility for the crisis, and there is nobody in the cockpit. That's his image. There's nobody in the cockpit today. So the banking sector, even today, is in a very, very volatile situation. So the Financial Times said, should we believe the bank bosses when they talk of imposing high ethical standards? Well, not according to Luijendijk. I remember I was visiting the Shanghai International Board of Arbitration 2 years ago, and I discussed the topic or the concept of ethics with people there. And it was almost impossible to discuss, because I don't know if there is no Chinese translation, but it was simply very, very difficult to convey this idea of ethics. So this is, I have to skip. This is some of the questions I have now after having thought of this before I came here, but also now. It's a picture of perhaps a law student from Fudan, whom I saw on the bus 2 years ago. and who's speaking about the climate change. And so I'm asking, what are the conflicts to solve? How? Influenced by what cultures, norms, and values? This I took from the description of the disputes. I took from SHIAC's homepage a few days ago. They have you can click on a link called social responsibility. I clicked on it. There was nothing. Absolutely. I tried several times. I thought, why is that? Why is there nothing on social responsibility? It has been talked about here today that seems to be a question. So one of the professors from Renmin said earlier today that or yesterday in his that Chinese investment is at as a crossroads. Is it at a crossroads, or is it at an end of a road, at a dead end? Where is it going? Is it, when I look through the abstracts, the concepts of illusion, hybridity, and uncertainty came up. So that is the image I am going away with, a culture of these elements, illusion, hybridity, and uncertainty, which we have to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for introducing the Chinese lawyer and professor in law, He Jialong. I'll get his books, and maybe some of you, particularly from Shanghai, you will know the Chinese writer of criminal stories, Chu Xiaolong. He is living in the United States, but I'll find the real name for those interested. Now we're looking forward to welcome the next presenter, speaker, Professor Ditlev Tamm, China as a Cultural Challenge. Please, the floor is yours.
A conference like this is a link in a chain of approaches between China and the West. This has been a very important and very fruitful approach because it's been treating a theme in which both the endeavors, the meanings, and the wish to have a results are meeting. I want to congratulate, therefore, first of all, my colleagues Joanna and Wen for organizing this, and also for asking me to come here and say a few words. If, to use a metaphor often used when I'm in Germany, you might consider what has been said until now like a very good, strong wine. You could consider what happens now when culture comes into the picture as a few drops of water, which may spoil or may enhance the joy of what you have already listened to. I've taken as the topic China as a cultural challenge. And my wish was to stress 3 points. First, I would analyze with you a few words from a speech made by a famous speaker. Second, I would make some reflections on what has happened in comparative law due to the changing role of China. And thirdly, I would like to share with you some reflections on the time when China was really a cultural challenge, namely in the 18th century, and see what conclusions we could draw from that. First point, in March 2014, the leader of China, Xi Jinping, visited France, and on the 27th of March, he made a speech in Paris on the occasion of the official dinner that was done there. In this speech, he talked about, as you might expect, relations between China and France. But there are a few remarkable points in this speech which I might try to highlight here with you. First of all, Xi Jinping starts not by mentioning the importance of France for China, but mentioning the importance of China for the world and for France, quoting the relations and how France has known and been influenced by the 100 schools of philosophy in China, by Lao Tzu, Confucius, Mozi, Mencius, and Zhuangzi, all philosophers whom are well known and were introduced yesterday by our president today. He also stresses how this philosophy was important for the development of French Enlightenment in the 18th century, and how Chinese style came also to be part of the decoration of French houses. And then he changes and talks about the importance of France for himself. And the speak is made as a personal statement by Xi Jinping of the importance of French culture from him. He says that by reading Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, Saint-Simon, and Sartre, his understanding how progress of the mind propels progress in society was deepened. Some very unrespectful people have on the internet raised doubt as to whether Xi Jinping has really read those books. I'm sure that he has done it, because he continues also by telling how much joy and happiness he has had by reading French literature, also political. First Chinese philosophers, then French philosophers, political philosophers, then French literature, then comes the importance and the improvement our aesthetic, which we can have by studying the French Impressionists, and then he talks about Chinese dreams, which are all enhanced by knowing this country, the dream of happiness, to do something good. And after all that comes that now China is also an important partner, and that there's important partnership between France and China in the field of trade. I like that very much. First culture, then trade. And it's basically one of those things I admire most in Chinese culture, that it's never enough that you just look at the world seen from a point of money, seen from the point of trade or investment, or seen from the point of law. To be a full person, you need to be influenced also by these beautiful things that are created in the world. In this way, I think, and I would really recommend those who have not read this speech, in a wonderful way shows how the head of the biggest and most populous state in the world look at the relation between culture and trade. My second impression, or my second reflection, will be as to how China has changed and the importance that has been. My own personal relation to China, so to say, having physically been there, started in 1992. I've come regularly, but I think one can say as a very general statement that if you had been there in 92 and you only came back in 2017, you will be unable to recognize Beijing or Shanghai or many other places. So much has happened in this time, and this is of course also the background for this conference of what we are telling. China was in the world always, but China is in the world in a completely different way, which is very different from what you looked at. This, and that is, so to say, the legal consequence which must be taken of this. This also has influenced very much one of those legal fields which has been my field, namely the field of comparative law. In comparative law, we used to talk about legal families. There was there were Western legal families, Anglo-Saxon law. There was the civil law. There were the religious families, and there was something called East Asia. And in East Asia, those legal cultures were put in, which you could not really understand. Japan and China was put together, and it was said, and that was for a long time, I think, also the common knowledge that a chief difference between what you could call the more Western way and the Eastern way was expressed in which in what used to be, so to say, the basic work in the field, namely the Introduction to Comparative Law, written by Zweigert and Kurtz. They had this concept, you remember, of style. And one of the styles would be which was important, was the litigation style. In the Westerns, they said, as the ideal type, that was the learning of Rudolf von Jhering, the idea that you struggle for your law and that law and Western law will only subsist if people really stand on the law, go to the courts and defend their positions. That's the way it works. And that you would be confronted with the Eastern way, the mediation way. Don't make confrontation. Don't stand too strongly. There is a life after this which must go on. It's much better that we find a peaceful composition. And very interesting, of course, is that it would not today, I think, be a way of explaining East and West, or China and Western system, to use this confrontation. This conference, I think, is really an illustration that time has changed the idea of not standing definitely on the litigation point, but being interested in and find other kinds of solution, has to a high degree come into also the Western system. And I would be reluctant not to acknowledge that there has been a strong influence there in looking at the Eastern and the Chinese way of doing things, which has strongly contributed to the mediation, alternative dispute resolutions being a very important part of procedural law today. On the other hand, there's also been an important development. I don't know how you personally look at it, but as I see it, China is rather clearly entering into the family, which you would call the civil law family, having a civil code and using and basically also interpreting the laws in a way that comes closer to the European way of doing it than to the American way of doing it. I think that's one of the most fascinating and interesting questions in looking at Chinese law today, so to say, to find out where is China actually in this old pattern, which has of course meant that we cannot use the legal families as a model in the same way. China has challenged, so to say, also the concept of legal families by having so many different elements within its own legal system, and using so many models and contributing in its way it's doing. So East and West, I think that's still in some ways the background, and that lures behind when we are meeting, when we are discussing these important subjects. But on the other hand, and I think when I read the abstracts of what have been said on this conference, it's also very clear that East and West, when it comes to arbitration and dispute solution, are very much speaking the same language. There are differences due to social and economic and probably also to some extent due to different kinds of government, but basically it's the same endeavor of solution, it's the same vocabulary that is being used when we are talking about such an important thing as is definitely the way in which in international trade and investment, you will find the best ways of solving, and the way which will be the most enduring of solving conflicts. Xi Jinping quotes Confucius saying that at 50, I know the mandate of heaven. I might say that at the age of over 70, I'm not quite sure whether I really know the mandate of heaven, but still I try in some way and think that one of the more interesting endeavors, also both as a lawyer and looking at culture, is to try to understand the challenge, which it is that China is so strongly on the scene as it is, as is happening today. And as said, it has had a big impact already within the comparative law in emerging as a country which cannot be in any way put into a taxonomy or a class of East Asia, but belongs to a class in which we are talking the same legal language. One of those who saw very much and was challenged by China, and I think in a most challenging way, was an author whom I'm sure you have all read, and if some of you are in the situation that you have not yet read The Spirit of the Laws by Montesquieu, I will urgently ask you to do it. As a lawyer, it's a standard work. It has given people since 1748, when it was first published, immense joy of knowing, understanding, reflecting exactly on this question we are reflecting on in a conference like this, namely, from where come the differences in the law? What are actually the roots? What's the spirit of the law? What is it that makes the law as it is in different countries? And what must we understand in order to keep a conversation on a level which we can really see as serious about what are our mutual concerns within the law? You remember that the starting point for Montesquieu in this book is reflections on the importance of government. And he has a basic distinction between three kinds of government. There would be the monarchy, one person demanding, but in a lenient way and foreseeable way. There would be the despot who rules as he wants himself without taking any regards to society, and there will be the republic in which people take part in the government. And each of these ways of government will have its own principle. For the monarchy, it will be the honor. In a monarchy, you will try to get a position due to your honor. In despoty, it will be the fear. You do what you do and you obey the law because you fear the consequences if you do not do it. And in the republic, the basic principle will be the virtue. People will do the things. The challenge that Montesquieu met was that as he could read what was written at that time on China, Montesquieu, of course, did not come himself ever to China. What he knew about China was to a high degree what he could read in the basic book on China at that time, written by a French Jesuit, Jean-Baptiste Duhalde, who was a professor of the Collège de France, and who published in 1735 and 36 a 4-volume book called The Description of China. This work was based on 17 relations and made by Jesuits who in the 16th century, in the footpath of Matteo Ricci, who was the first, so to say, who established himself in China, 1601, who made the relations and explained how everything was functioned in China very positively. And as one could of course understand, also Matteo Ricci was received by the emperor and the first European to come to the Forbidden City, was very positive as to how China was governed. On the other hand, there were the stories told by tradesmen how they were always cheated, they could never count on anything and whatever. So the dilemma of Montesquieu was what to believe And especially, the idea was that if despoty and fear comes together, it didn't seem that in China there was fear of the government. It was not that way. So the Chinese way of doing it, which combined the different elements from the different ways of government, and which combined these systems, was overcome by, as he saw it, by the manners in which the Chinese society was ruled, and therefore he could not, as Japan, of course, despoty, very easy. China, very much more complicated to find out actually what was happening. And when you take the book and you read it or you reread it, you'll see that how in nearly all his chapters there'll be remarks on how things are in China. The religion, Li and Fa. He didn't know that there was a Tang or that there was a Qing code, but still had all this information and discusses it, and therefore exactly China is perhaps the most important country mentioned in this big book, because that's where it's all challenged, which might look as very easy until you come to that point. Others challenges, and I'll be brief. Another very important challenge was in 1721, the famous natural law philosopher Christian Thomasius made a speech in Halle in which he introduced what he called the Chinese practical philosophy, especially Confucius. This speech was seen by the Christian clergy, the Christian authorities at that time, as like talking about atheism instead of Christianity, and Wolf lost his position for that and had to go abroad, and was only very later. So you might say Chinese philosophy also gave rise to one of the most important and well-known academic disputes in 18th century Europe, namely the dispute link to what Christian Wolf saw and how he actually saw a parallel and a spiritual fellow in Confucius and his way of do it. So French Enlightenment is really the place to look if you want to see what this challenge is about, seen from a cultural point of view. I'll end this
Thank you very much.
And I'll do it just by reminding you of what a challenge actually is. Challenges can be of many sorts. A challenge, as the Oxford Dictionary will tell you, can be a call to participate in a competitive situation. We see, of course, a part of that when we look of China. They can even be entering into a fight to see who is the superior. Or it can be, as the Cambridge Dictionary, I think a little more so softer says, it can be the situation that needs great mental and physical effort to be done successfully. I think that's where we are when it comes to the West and to East and West, and to the subject treated in this conference. Great intellectual efforts are needed, and as I see it, are also being used, and not in vain. And with that, I'll thank you for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the two so far very disciplined speakers. Very interesting presentations. Thank you. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Liu Chunrong from the Fudan-European Center for China Studies, located at Copenhagen University, the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies.
Thank you, Carsten, and thanks to also to Joanna and Wenxian and all the organizers for having me here. I also try to be a bit disciplined in terms of time control. It's a great honor to join these two distinguished panels to address the cultural matters. I'm not I have to say, I'm not an expert on economic dispute resolution. I'm a political scientist and sociologist by training. But I have been what has been said. I'm also have been a kind of a China watcher, and so I was made in China. I came from China, so I would like to share some join this discussions on this cultural dimensions of China's rise and Chinese society and legal system, which is essentially a very important issue. My presentation will be a part of my previous paper, which I was invited to join a debate about so-called East Asia peace, relative peace of East Asia as a zone, compared to what happened in history and other part of the world. So basically, my argument is that contrary to the conventional wisdoms, we draw from liberalism, draw from realism, arguing that peace is possible due to hegemon, power games, or due to economic interdependence. We need a deeper understanding about the role of frame alignments, cultural elements. So, but I'd like to address this issue from a broader picture for this talk. When people talk about China's rise and the consequences of China's rise, political scientists in particular would like to say 3 M's: money, muscle, and minds. Okay, you can measure or you can demonstrate China's rise in terms of its economic might, and in terms of military modernization, in terms of cultural influence. How can we understand China's cultural influence? It's not so easy to measure and debate. And there has been a lot of interesting projects trying to measure China's influence. Like one of this is to see so-called relative diplomatic power, which measured China's participation in international organizations, etc. And material power is easy to measure. You calculate GDP percentage, population size, and technology. So a lot of very interesting work on. But as I said, how to understand China's cultural influence. Okay, I mean, a lot of speakers and scholars in this conference talk about Belt and Road Initiative, and I would like to invite more attention to the proposal of this grand strategy. Well, this strategy involves a kind of multi-phased dimensions, not only infrastructure, investments, financial cooperation, but also a very important building block, that is cultural exchange. And China tried to seek to address the perception gap of China and seek this cultural understanding about China. So. And as many of you may observe, there's a ongoing debate about this cultural influences of China. Drawing from Joseph Nye's talk about the soft power. Recently, some scholars talk about soft power, which is very debatable and about the nature of China's cultural influence, and how China can pursue a kind of harmony. Despite so many diversities and risk, in different regions, and here I second what had been said in this panel. It's important to understand some Chinese perspective on this, because as some scholars addressed, to see China and the world the way that influential Chinese see the China and see China and the world, that's very important. So let me come back to my paper a bit. So as I said, we try to understand the driving force of East Asia peace, And the puzzle is that, there has been a kind of relative peace since late 1970s in East Asia, which is not coincidence, associated with China's open reform. So Stein-Thøgersen raised this issue and summarized this issue, having seen war after war since 1840, after having suffered the world's most worst wars, Second World War in the East Asia Pacific. How could East Asia become a region of peace and prosperity? Okay, there has been a lot of competing explanations on this issue, right? And to look at the so-called relative peace, and scholars tend to calculate the numbers of interstate war, armed conflicts. Okay, it's not a dispute in legal terms of this territory and interstate conflicts. So enormously, there has been a kind of decrease of interstate conflicts in this region. If you compare the period between 1940s to late 1970s and period since 1980s, and the East Asia share in the different forms of conflict, interstate or intrastate, has been declined very significantly, and this, deserve a good explanation. Well, if we come back to literature, and a lot of theories, tends to try to offer a explanation. As I said, there's a very prevalent argument on talking about economic interdependence will lead to a kind of peaceful coexistence, so-called economic security nexus. Okay, and people, if you draw theories from realists, talk about hegemonic stability because the role of the United States. Okay, and I found that much of the discussions has been neglecting a kind of nuanced role and analysis about the role of culture. Okay, what kind of norms and cultures has been created to mediate this potential conflicts? Well, we know that East Asia has been a kind of very very conflictual society, divided, right? Well, institutions certainly matters. There has been a phenomenal institutional building in this region, and there has been phenomenal explosion of economic ties, the flow of trade and flow of people in this region. But these are not necessarily guarantee a kind of peace in this region. So to come back to the topic of this session, I think we need to carefully bring the culture back in. And culture is not a tool to increase attraction. Okay, so what soft power thesis content. And what I try to argue is that culture it's also an important resource to create a kind of a cognitive resonance, okay, in policy making. So this is what we call the frame alignment, which I draw from collective action and social movement theory, and also inspired a bit from the constructivism, which basically argue that we need a kind of frame alignment. You need to seek mutual understanding. You need to identify synergies in terms of interests, beliefs, and values, norms in community building. To the extent that stakeholders in the region can reach this sort of flame alignment, there is a more likely to expect peaceful relations. Okay, I won't go into details about those, how this, framework, was developed. But one of the core concepts here is called master frame. You need a you need a frame that can, speak to different, cultural entities. Okay, and the question here is whether and how China can deliver such kind of master frame, and so as to contribute to regional peace. And yesterday, Carsten talked about policy thinking of China, how China entered into the world, and I'd like to resonate to him that, well, if you quickly review this, the ideas behind China's foreign policy, you find this ideas has more or less functioned as a kind of master frame that could, perhaps I'm more or less optimistic, that could contribute to a kind of peaceful development at least in East Asia. And the core of this policy norms, ideas, it's a kind of relationality. But Chinese IR theorists that's trying to develop a kind of a new thinking about Chinese foreign policy to explain. So relationality is actually deeply grounded in Confucianism's thought. So people are relational. Okay, so and as Chen Yaqing, a leading China's IR theorist, talk about this. This is a process of negotiating socio-political arrangements that manage complex relationships in a community to produce order, so that members behave in a reciprocal and cooperative fashion with mutual trust that evolves through a shared understanding of social norms and human morality. Okay, so well, my paper addressed some case studies on the development of master frame, and the case of China-ASEAN engagement is it's a very interesting case, because there's been a huge dispute in the South China Sea, and surprisingly this dispute has been managed quite well. And what is the logic behind that? And what I try to claim is that the China's policy really have been successfully reach a kind of resonance, and which lead to policy congruence, in terms of interconnectivity. Okay. I think I try to use my some point in this paper to come back to this panel discussion. I think to discuss the nature and the mechanisms of cultural influence of China, it's no easy job. We need a lot more debates, but I tend to think that as China rise, China will not rise as a country with only economic influence, but also a kind of cultural presence. And when we talk about cultural influence, we talk about EU as a normative power. Okay, so but will China deliver some sort of a normative influence, at least in East Asia? So I leave this question open for discussion, and also I see some possibility to dialogue with what Professor Tamm mentioned, China's rise as a cultural challenge. Okay, so let me stop here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chunrong. And now we lost we lost 2 minutes, but we have 12 minutes left for questions and answers, Q&A. So please, there's one question up here. Please, the microphone.
So I was quite inspired by the Professor Tamm's remarks about the President Xi's speech in France 2014. Your first point, quoting from the President Xi, is about his way of talking about culture. First culture, then about the interests, trade. I think this is very much the Chinese. First, to build, to create a kind of context, then we talk about interests. This, I think, echoes with Professor Carsten's remarks yesterday. He talks about the justice and interest. Justice light. Justice is having interest is light. 重义轻利. And first justice and then interest. 先义后利. Chinese approaching about justice and interest. This is a quite kind of a guidance principle when China is engaging with the outside world. So where the I think Professor Tamm's the title of the topic is called China's Cultural Challenge. I see there is a kind of solution here. That is, culture is kind of overarching, or you can find common interest there when we are talking about interest. Actually, in Chinese traditional culture, we consider justice and those the morality always go first, and this can be the priority of the interest, or the largest interest where interest exists. So I would propose China as a kind of cultural challenge rather than China as a cultural solution. Professor Liu just talked about the master frame. Where can we find the master frame? I think that can be as candidate for cultural frame. Well, Chinese famous sociologist called Fei Xiaotong has a very famous remark that is, I just now try to find the English translation. I think this is a good translation. He said, find your beauty and that of others, and share the beauty and achieve unity. So it means once China's culture, China respects its own culture. Chinese do not try to advocate or to push others to accept its culture or value. Meanwhile, the Chinese also respect others' culture. So this is, I think, the master frame. Can be the master frame. Thank you.
So, if there's a comment here, now we're going into the philosophical area. I think very interesting. I have to just say that talking about yesterday about justice and interest, and now Ditlev Tamm talking about common interest, you will say there is no such word as common interest. There is the common thing is in justice to be fair, and then there are your interests which you have to pursue. But this is getting somewhat philosophical, and I will just withdraw and ask the panelists to.
I liked very much your remarks because I think that one of the most important contributions of China in today's world is that let us reflect on the importance of culture, and even in a legal conference, that we understand that all this may be okay as rules, but this should be seen in a broader context in which we have different layers and which are very important. And in some ways, and that's why I take Montesquieu, and that's why I appreciate very much that Xi Jinping actually mentions Montesquieu, because that's exactly what Montesquieu is doing and is contributing to the legal world, saying that we cannot understand the law if we do not understand this whole cultural context. So my suggestion for next time would be we start with the culture, we do much more culture, and then the law can come in. Thank you very much.
Any of Hanne?
No.
You too?
Well, can I join too? Yeah, thank you for the wonderful comments. I do also feel that there's a growing, moral obligations on China, foreign policy. If you look at in the 1940 Congress, the President Xi Jinping's speech address a lot of justice and fairness in a global system. China is growing sensitive to the this dark side of globalization. So and also I like your remarks about the facial tones thoughts. Indeed, yeah, I think it's important to, as I mentioned, to seek harmony in the world of diversity. But I think we can also build up this idea to suggest or to propose that without interconnectivity, those diversity would easily lead to conflict. So how to prevent, how to avoid conflict, in a growing diverse world. That's the challenge to China's foreign policy. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think we have two questions here, and we'll take both of the questions, and then we'll have the answers here, and then we will finalize. Please put the questions short. More questions, not so much a comment.
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm not making a question, just a piece of brief information to Professor Petersen. And when you were speaking, I took a couple of pictures of your slides, and I sent them to Professor He Jiahong, the novelist, and he responded to me very quickly that since it's Beijing time, it's kind of 9 o'clock right now, and he felt very much honored that his books are helpful for you to understand the Chinese legal culture, and he hopes that there might be future opportunities to exchange ideas with you in that regard. Thank you.
So that is really interconnectivity, I would say. So thank you. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Louise. I'm a master's student at the Faculty of Law. I have a question for you, Professor Leo. You started off mentioning the One Belt, One Road initiative, and in that context mentioned soft power and sharp power, which I think is a really interesting concept I haven't heard before, because we've mentioned the One Belt, One Road initiative, I think, in every section of this conference, but mostly in relation to financial cooperation. And I find it interesting that you also mentioned the South China Sea, which arguably could be called more hard power than soft power, thinking of military bases and so on. So I wondered if you would elaborate on what soft power and sharp power is. I know it's a broad question, but specifically speaking of the One Belt, One Road initiative, and what you mentioned, not only financial cooperation, but also cultural exchange. Well, if financial cooperation is sharp power, or maybe even soft power, what is cultural exchange, and how does that happen in One Belt, One Road? Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, and I think this is very sharp question. I hope my panelists can also join with your inputs. I don't have neat answers for that. Well, this if you look at the Economist, there's a special report on sharp power, and I think that's basically a kind of an extension of the soft power thesis by Joseph Nye, but more on negative side of soft power. Basically, talk about authoritarian regime, project influence in the global scale. It's more critical approach. But I think the discussion can be misleading in that way. But I think that the debates on hard power, soft power, and sharp power could be very interesting if you combine it to as you suggest, the empirical cases in One Belt, One Road in South China Sea. That's definitely. But in South China Sea, I think soft power, certainly doesn't work as some people would expect. That's why I try to direct the discussions to a bit more on the frame alignment, namely to see how the concept of interconnectivity shape the perceptions of each other, which lead to the peaceful coexistence. So if these stakeholders in the region manage to reach a kind of frame resonance, then the policy can be very conducive for a kind of peaceful developments. So it's not about the soft power issues, about the other aspects of cultural influences.
Okay.
Could I just add a comment on this? Because I'm wondering whether this process we are dealing with internationally now will also require a presentation, development of concepts coming out of a Chinese context, and not a sort of an adaptation as this soft, hard, sharp, whatever, seems to be an adaptation to an American approach. And I was just thinking of the some of these terms which have been used and developed, and I cannot remember the last version of international policy in China on the community of common destiny or something like that, which seems to me to be very much related to perhaps an emerging culture, perhaps an emerging global culture, something, the dynamic aspects of culture I was speaking about earlier also, where it seems to me there may be a potential for a considerable Chinese influence in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and this ends this last session on cultural issues, and I suppose you will now take over, Joanna, and make your concluding remarks.